Why is it that we seem completely incapable of getting U.S. foreign policy right? As recently seen by the interview with Tucker Carlson and Senator Ted Cruz, we also seem to be fighting a lot about it. Among my many issues with U.S. foreign policy over the last several decades is that it has created an environment where people get improperly categorized into either a warmongering neoconservative or a derpy isolationist pacifist. Any nuance whatsoever automatically makes you a traitor to one side or the other, and this makes it impossible to even ask questions about a potential conflict without the discussion degrading into accusations of you either being a war criminal or a patsy for America's enemies. Now, as someone who's actually served overseas and therefore has lived at the business end of what I would argue turned out to be pretty bad U.S. foreign policy, I can assure you I am very aware of the costs associated with poorly considered military intervention. Having said that, I also understand that our enemies get a say in whether or not armed conflict takes place, unless, of course, you're just willing to sit back and get attacked. And just like misguided intervention is dangerous, so too is perceived weakness or blindness to current and emerging threats. So I think having a healthy skepticism about foreign intervention is the right starting point. But if such a view can't be overcome with facts and evidence, then it ceases to be very useful in a complex world. By the same token, can we just be honest here? Not every threat is an actual clear and present danger to the United States. Hell, half the time it seems like we find out the threat that got us into a war wasn't really much of a threat after all, much less one that required massive military intervention for decades. But we should also consider that there are times when military intervention may be warranted. When a country has engaged in illegal or aggressive acts, or even acts of terrorism, we may need to send a strong message, and that might need to include force, whether it's to protect our own military, citizens, or allies. But again, it shouldn't automatically mean that that means engaging in a multi-generational effort to replace whatever government they have with some sort of multi-party parliamentary democracy that is probably going to fail as soon as we leave. In fact, using force may just mean a very surgical operation that takes care of the problem, or maybe reminds the hostile regime of the natural order of things. But one of the biggest problems that we have right now is that that sort of nuanced conversation doesn't seem to be allowed to take place. The idea of no new wars is supposed to mean you can't engage in any new military interventions whatsoever. And it's certainly understandable why people would take that position. We've been engaging in military interventions for the last 25 years that cost us a lot of time and money to either replace the Taliban with the Taliban or to essentially hand the government of Iraq over to the Iranians, neither of which was in America's interest long term and cost us a lot of blood and treasure in the first place. And we need to be able to look at potential interventions in the future through that lens so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. By the same token, not every intervention has to look like that. For instance, in the mid-1980s, when Iran was mining the Straits of Hormuz and actually struck a U.S. ship, which was completely against international law, there was a military response to that. And within 8 hours, Iran lost a bunch of ships, and turns out they stopped mining the Straits of Hormuz. So we were able to achieve a military and foreign policy objective without actually engaging a full-blown war. Now, was that the right course of action? I happen to think it was, but we can debate that. The important point is to remember that nowhere in the Reagan administration did they think getting Iran to comply with international law was going to require a 20-year-long invasion, because that's not the only option open to us. So while we should be careful, and we should certainly be very, very cautious about anybody that wants to commit troops overseas to make the world safe for democracy, we should also understand that sometimes a heavy hand is needed. Soft power doesn't have a great deal of influence if it's not backed up by hard power. And while hard power should be used very, very sparingly and very, very judiciously, sometimes it is necessary. And discussions about when that is appropriate and to what extent and what are the responsibilities of the executive branch versus Congress when it comes to concepts like declaring war. How do we decipher between something that just requires a small surgical strike versus something that is going to require greater American commitment? All of those are discussions that we need to have. And I certainly want people like Senator Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson to have those discussions. But they need to be honest ones. They need to be honest ones which recognize that these are incredibly complex things to consider. Sometimes large military intervention may be required. But that should be the last resort, and it should pass an incredibly high threshold, which actually requires a declaration of war. Other times, we may need a surgical strike by special operations or a cruise missile in order to defend American citizens, American military personnel, and American ship, with no greater follow-on required. All of that needs robust debate from multiple perspectives, sharing information, data, history, and experience in order to come to good conclusions about what's necessary and appropriate, while taking into account unintended consequences, second and third order effects. Because as we've all discovered, taking out one bad guy doesn't automatically mean he's going to be replaced with a great guy. In fact, it could be something far worse. And that is why I think we do need to have a robust conversation about what American first foreign policy should look like. Because whatever we end up deciding, I know this much: poorly defined concepts create division and chaos, and we can afford neither when it comes to foreign policy and national defense.